Dust doesn't care who it buries, and love rarely survives a dry summer in the territory. Cora knew both facts intimately. She was a woman built for surviving, carrying the weight of a dead husband and a town's whispered pity on shoulders as broad as a plow horse's. She swore she was done with men, locking her heart behind a widow's heavy grief. Then a battered drifter leaned against her doorframe, bleeding through his coat, and made a joke that ruined her peace forever. The August heat in Red Creek didn't just sit on you. It pressed down like a physical hand, trying to drive you into the dirt. Cora felt it most in the late afternoons, standing over the massive cast-iron stove in the back kitchen of her boarding house. She slammed the flat iron down onto the damp cotton of a patron's shirt. Steam hissed, smelling of hot lye and scorched thread. Cora leaned her considerable weight into the handle. She was a massive woman. There was no polite way the townsfolk phrased it when they thought she couldn't hear. She was heavy-set, broad, fat. Her calico dresses required double the yardage of the other women in town, and the fabric pulled tight across her thick upper arms and wide hips. She didn't mind her size. It gave her the gravity needed to heave a stubborn drunk out of the parlor and the momentum to scrub floorboards until they were white. What she minded was the invisibility that came with it. To the men of Red Creek, Cora was a fixture. She was the hot meals, the clean sheets, the mended hems. She was a widow, neutral and sexless, wrapped in a black mourning shawl she hadn't taken off in 3 years since Arthur died. Arthur hadn't died in a shootout or breaking a wild Mustang. He died of a rotting tooth that swelled his jaw and stopped his heart in 3 agonizing days. It was a stupid, ugly death, leaving Cora with a half-paid mortgage and a cynical understanding of how fragile life really was. Cora set the iron back on the stove and wiped the sweat pooling beneath her breasts with the back of her forearm. The kitchen door creaked open, scraping against the warped floorboard. She didn't turn around immediately. "Kitchen's closed until supper. If you want a drink, the saloon's down the street." "Ain't looking for a drink," a voice rasped. It was a low sound, like boots dragging across gravel. "Looking for a bed. Heard the widow Miller keeps a clean house." Cora turned. The man leaning against the doorframe wasn't a local. He was tall, but slouched in a way that suggested his bones hurt. A layer of pale trail dust coated his boots, his canvas trousers, and the dark leather duster he wore despite the suffocating heat. He held his left arm tight against his ribs. Dark, wet blood seeped through the fabric of his shirt, turning the gray cotton black. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a stray dog that had lost a fight over a bone. "I run a boarding house, mister, not a hospital," Cora said flatly. Her voice was steady, practiced in shutting down trouble before it started. "Just need a bed," he repeated, his jaw tight. He reached into his pocket with his good hand and tossed a gold eagle onto the scrubbed pine table. It spun, flashed in the dull light, and settled with a heavy clink. "That cover a week?" Cora eyed the coin, then the man. "That covers the bed, bandages, hot water, and my silence will cost you another." The corner of his mouth twitched upward, just a fraction. He reached into his pocket and tossed a second coin. "Deal." Cora wiped her hands on her apron and stepped around the table. As she approached him, she braced herself for the usual subtle shifts in a man's posture. The slight step back, the widening of the eyes as her true bulk registered. Men accustomed to the delicate, corseted waists of the saloon girls often looked at Cora like she was a different species entirely. The stranger didn't flinch. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met hers squarely. They tracked the stern set of her jaw, the dark hair escaping her severe bun, and the broad expanse of her shoulders. He didn't look through her. He looked at her. "Name's Harlan," he grunted, the effort of standing finally seeming to catch up with him. "Cora," she replied, grabbing his good arm and draping it over her shoulder. The man smelled horse sweat, gunpowder, and old leather. He was heavy, but Cora was stronger. She took the brunt of his weight with a grunt, anchoring her thick legs on the floorboards to keep them both upright. "Stairs are this way. Don't bleed on my rugs." They made it up the narrow staircase. The wooden steps groaned under Cora's weight, a sound she despised. She waited for the joke. There was always a joke. "Careful, the house might come down." Or, "Need a block and tackle for this climb?" Harlan said nothing. He just breathed raggedly through his teeth, matching her slow, deliberate pace. She dumped him onto the mattress in room number 4. It groaned loudly. Harlan bit back a groan of his own as he hit the quilt. "Keep pressure on that," Cora ordered, pointing at his ribs. "I'll get the boiling water and the carbolic acid. You scream, I'll gag you with a towel. The other boarders don't like a racket." Harlan let out a short, breathy laugh that immediately turned into a cough. "Yes, ma'am." For the next hour, Cora worked in grim silence. She stripped away the ruined shirt, revealing a torso mapped with old scars and the angry raw tear of a fresh bullet graze across his lower ribs. It wasn't deep, but it was dirty. She cleaned it with ruthless efficiency. Her thick, capable fingers moved over his skin without hesitation. She wasn't gentle, but she was exact. Through it all, Harlan watched her. When the pain flared, he didn't close his eyes. He kept them fixed on her face, watching the intense concentration furrowing her brow, the way she bit her lower lip, the steady rise and fall of her heavy chest. When she finished wrapping the clean linen tight around his ribs, she stepped back, wiping her bloodied hands on a rag. "You'll live," she said, "if fever don't take you." "Obliged," Harlan muttered, his head sinking into the pillow. Cora gathered the bloody basin. "Supper's at 6. I'll send a plate up. Don't expect me to feed it to you." "Wouldn't dream of it, Cora." She paused at the door, her spine stiffening. No one in town called her Cora anymore. She was just the widow Miller. The sound of her own name on a man's lips felt strange, like an old dress that didn't fit right anymore. She didn't correct him. She just shut the door behind her, leaving him in the shadowed room, and went back down to the oppressive heat of her kitchen. 3 days passed. The fever Cora expected never came. Harlan possessed the frustrating, resilient constitution of a weed. By the second day, he was sitting up. By the third, he was downstairs, occupying a chair in the corner of the dining room, eating beef stew with the slow, deliberate motion of a man favoring a cracked rib. He didn't talk much. He just watched. Cora felt his eyes on her as she moved through the room, balancing heavy trays of cornbread and roasted potatoes. It set her teeth on edge. She was accustomed to being ignored, retreating into the background noise of her own house. Harlan's gaze was a spotlight she didn't want. Late that evening, after the other boarders had retired or headed to the saloon, Cora walked out onto the back porch. The air was finally cooling, carrying the scent of dry pine and dust. She carried a steaming mug of black coffee, her one indulgence at the end of a grueling day. She let out a long sigh, sinking her heavy frame onto the top step. The wood creaked in familiar protest. She untied her apron, letting it fall beside her, and rubbed the aching joints of her knees. "You work too hard!" Cora jumped, coffee sloshing over the rim of the mug onto her knuckles. She cursed, shaking her hand. Harlan stepped out from the shadows of the porch overhang. He was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, the cherry glowing dull orange in the twilight. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side, and slowly lowered himself onto the step next to her. He didn't sit too close, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "You sneak around too much," Cora snapped, licking the burned coffee off her skin. "Force of habit," he replied mildly, taking a drag from his cigarette. "I've been watching you haul water, chop wood, and feed 6 grown men all by yourself. Don't you have help?" "Help costs money." "So does breaking your back," Cora scoffed, wrapping both thick hands around her mug. "My back is fine, Mr. Harlan. It's built for the load. You don't need to concern yourself with my business. Just an observation." He exhaled a thin stream of smoke into the night air. The crickets in the tall grass beyond the yard began their rhythmic chirping. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind Cora was used to with Arthur. It was a comfortable emptiness. She stole a glance at Harlan. The swelling around his eye had gone down, leaving a mottled yellow bruise. His profile was sharp, harsh, carved out by whatever hard life he'd been living before he bled on her rug. "Why'd you really come to Red Creek?" she asked, the question slipping out before her cynical mind could stop it. "Just passing through," he said. "People don't get shot just passing through." Harlan chuckled, a low rumble that ended in a slight wince. "Sometimes they do, Cora. Sometimes you're just in the wrong place when another man makes a bad decision." He shifted on the hard wooden step. As he did, his knee brushed against her thigh. Cora instantly pulled her leg back, a hot flush of embarrassment crawling up her neck. She drew her knees closer together, trying to minimize the space she took up, folding herself inward. Harlan noticed. He looked down at the gap she had forcefully created between them, then looked up at her face in the moonlight. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "Do what?" she deflected, staring rigidly out at the dark tree line. "Shrink." The word hit her like a physical blow. Cora's jaw tightened. "I'm not shrinking. I just don't like being crowded." Harlan dropped the butt of his cigarette on the dirt and ground it out beneath the heel of his boot. He leaned his elbows on his knees, turning his head to look at her fully. "You spend all day taking up space, bossing men around, running this place like a general. But the second I sat down, you tried to disappear." "You don't know anything about me," Cora said, her voice dropping an octave, a defensive wall slamming down. "I know you think nobody's looking at you," Harlan said, his voice entirely devoid of pity. It was just a statement of fact. "And I know you think if they are looking, it's not because they want to." Cora's hand shook slightly around her mug. Anger, hot and bright, flared in her chest. How dare he? How dare this bleeding stray walk into her yard and dissect the quiet misery she had spent years burying? "Mr. Harlan," she said, her tone freezing over, "you paid for a bed and board. You didn't pay for the right to sit on my porch and insult me." She planted her hands on her knees, preparing to heave herself up and walk inside. Before she could rise, Harlan reached out, his calloused, rough hand wrapped around her thick wrist. He didn't grip it hard, but the contact was startling enough to freeze her in place. His thumb brushed over the prominent bones of her wrist, sending a jolt of electricity up her arm that she hadn't felt in a decade. "I wasn't insulting you, Cora," he said softly. "I was just telling you that you're wrong." Cora stared at his hand on her skin. The contrast was stark. He was all wire and bone and sinew. She was soft, substantial, heavy. She waited for the revulsion to hit him, waited for him to realize he was touching the town's massive, invisible widow. But he didn't let go. Her heart battered frantically against her ribs. Fear, sharp and terrifying, rose in her throat. She couldn't do this. She couldn't let someone see the lonely, desperate woman hiding beneath the capable, fat widow. The rejection would kill her faster than a bullet. She violently jerked her arm out of his grasp. "I can't," she whispered. Her voice cracked, betraying the cynical armor she wore so well. She scrambled backward on the step, clutching the coffee mug to her chest like a shield. "I'm a widow." She used the word like an iron gate slamming shut. Widow, untouchable, done. Past her prime, past her worth, belonging only to a ghost and the dirt. Harlan didn't chase her. He stayed seated, resting his hands loosely between his knees. He looked up at her, standing there trembling in the moonlight, trying so hard to be intimidating and failing utterly. A slow, wry smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Good," he joked, his rough voice carrying easily over the chirping crickets. "I won't have to duel anyone for you." Cora stopped. The words hung in the warm night air. She stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the cruel smirk that usually followed a joke at her expense. It never came. Harlan just sat there, looking up at her with those steady, washed-out blue eyes, entirely serious beneath the humor. For the first time in 3 years, the heavy, suffocating armor around Cora's chest cracked. She stood on the porch, holding her half-empty mug of coffee, completely entirely disarmed. Morning came with the brutal reliability of a hammer striking an anvil. Before the sun even breached the horizon, painting the dry plains in streaks of bruised purple, Cora was already in the kitchen. She attacked a mound of biscuit dough with unnecessary violence. Her knuckles sank deep into the sticky flour, pressing, folding, punishing it. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the rough, low gravel of Harlan's voice. "I won't have to duel anyone for you." It was a joke. It had to be. Men like Harlan, lean, dangerous, unmoored, didn't look at women like her. They looked for soft, pliable things. Cora was a fortress of bone and bulk, barricaded behind years of sweat and grief. She slammed the dough onto the floured board, cut the biscuits with the rim of a tin cup, and shoved the heavy iron pan into the oven. She wiped her forehead with a floury forearm. Her heart still felt entirely too large for her chest, thumping an erratic, painful rhythm. By the time the boarders trickled downstairs, smelling of bay rum and unwashed wool, Cora was a machine of sheer efficiency. She doled out eggs, salt pork, and coffee, her face set in its usual stony mask. Harlan came down last. He wore a fresh shirt, one of Arthur's old ones Cora had left folded on his dresser, pretending it was just standard service for a paying guest. The cotton pulled a little tight across his broad shoulders, but it was clean. He walked with less of a limp, his pale eyes tracking her the moment he entered the room. Cora didn't look at him. She poured his coffee, set a plate of pork in front of him, and retreated to the safety of the kitchen. She expected him to leave. His ribs were healing. He had his horse in the livery. He was a drifter. Drifting was what they did. But mid-morning, as Cora dragged the heavy wooden wash tub out into the backyard, she found him standing by the water pump. He had rolled up his sleeves. He held a rusted wrench in his good hand, inspecting the cracked iron handle of the pump. "What are you doing?" Cora demanded, dropping the tub. It hit the dust with a dull thud. Harlan didn't flinch. He just tapped the wrench against the iron. "Pump's leaking, wasting water. The hinge is practically stripped." "I know it's stripped. I've been pumping it sideways for a year." "Don't have to anymore," he said. He knelt down, grimacing slightly as his injured side stretched, and clamped the wrench onto the rusted bolt. The veins in his forearm stood out like cords of wire as he torqued the metal. Cora crossed her thick arms over her chest. "I didn't ask for a handyman." "Didn't say you did." Harlan grunted, putting his back into the wrench. The bolt let out a terrible screech and gave way. "Just hate seeing good machinery go to ruin. Hate seeing people work harder than they need to, too." "My work is my business." Harlan stopped. He looked up at her from the dirt, shielding his eyes from the climbing sun. Sweat beaded at his temples. "You're an angry woman, Cora, and you're a trespassing stray." Instead of bristling, Harlan smiled. It was a small, genuine thing that crinkled the battered skin around his eyes. "Fair enough. But I'm a stray that knows how to fix a water pump. You want the tub filled or not?" Cora hesitated. The muscles in her shoulders burned from the morning's labor. The thought of not having to wrestle the crooked handle for 20 minutes was a temptation she couldn't deny. She uncrossed her arms. "Fill it. But don't expect me to knock a nickel off your board." Harlan let out a dry chuckle. "Wouldn't dare." He fixed the pump. Then he fixed the loose floorboard on the back porch. When the afternoon sun turned the yard into a blinding furnace, he took an axe and methodically split a week's worth of firewood, working slowly to accommodate his ribs, but never stopping. Cora watched him through the kitchen window. She watched the steady rhythmic swing of the axe. She watched the way he wiped the sweat from his neck with a dirty rag. He wasn't performing for her. He was simply working, contributing to the space he occupied. She hated how much it settled her nerves. Arthur had been a man of grand ideas and empty hands. He had talked endlessly about expanding the boarding house, buying a cattle herd, building an empire. But when the roof leaked, Cora was the one on the ladder. When the winter firewood ran low, Cora was the one swinging the axe. Harlan didn't talk. He just swung the axe. Later, as the evening cooled, Cora brought him a tin cup of cold water. He had finished the wood and was sitting on a stump, his breathing heavy. She handed him the cup. Her thick fingers brushed his knuckles. She didn't pull away this time. "You didn't have to do all that," she said, quietly. Harlan drank the water in 3 long gulps. He lowered the cup, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "My coin runs out tomorrow. Figured I'd buy myself another day or 2 of your cooking." Cora looked at the massive pile of split wood. It would save her hours of backbreaking labor. She looked back at Harlan, searching his weathered face for the trap, the hidden cost. There wasn't one. "The wood covers 3 days," she said, her voice gruff to hide the sudden, treacherous softening in her chest. But you're fixing the pantry door tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," Harlan said, his pale eyes holding hers, warm and steady. Town day was Cora's least favorite day of the week. It meant hitching the old draft horse to the buckboard wagon and driving down the main thoroughfare of Red Creek. It meant leaving the sanctuary of her boarding house and stepping into the public eye. The mercantile was run by a man named Dawson. He was a thin, sour-faced man who sold flour by the barrel and gossip by the hour. He had never outright insulted Cora, but he possessed a terrible, cutting politeness that made her entirely aware of her size. He was the king of the lingering glance at her wide hips, the master of the subtle, patronizing sigh when she squeezed down the narrow aisles of his shop. Cora pulled the wagon up to the mercantile's loading dock. She wrapped the reins around the brake lever and prepared to heave herself down. Before she could move, a hand appeared in her periphery. Harlan stood by the wagon wheel. He had ridden into town on his own horse, tailing the wagon in silence. He didn't say a word. He just offered his hand. Cora stared at it. She hadn't been helped out of a wagon in a decade. "I can manage, Mr. Harlan." "I know you can," he said calmly, his hand remaining exactly where it was. "Ain't about what you can manage." Cora swallowed hard. She placed her large, calloused hand into his. His grip was firm, bracing her heavy frame with ease as she stepped down onto the dusty planks of the boardwalk. A strange, unfamiliar heat blossomed in her chest. It felt terrifyingly like dignity. They walked into the mercantile together. Dawson looked up from his ledger. His eyes darted from Cora to the tall, scarred man walking a half-step behind her and back again. A greasy smile spread across his face. "Widow Miller," Dawson drawled, wiping his hands on an apron that hadn't seen lye soap in a month. "Early today. Must have a powerful hunger." Cora felt her spine turn to steel. She placed her list on the counter. 50 pounds of flour, Dawson, 10 pounds of sugar, coffee, and a sack of pinto beans, loaded in the back. Dawson picked up the list, his eyes lingering on Harlan. "Big order. But then, you always were a sturdy woman, Cora. Takes a lot of fuel to keep a stove that size burning, eh?" It was a standard Dawson barb, a little jab masked as a rural observation. Normally, Cora would stare blankly right through him, pay her money, and leave. It was easier to be stoned than to bleed. But as Dawson chuckled at his own joke, a shadow fell over the counter. Harlan stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't draw the heavy Colt strapped to his hip. He simply placed both hands flat on the wooden counter and leaned in until his face was inches from Dawson's. "You're going to load the wagon," Harlan said. The rough gravel of his voice was gone, replaced by something flat, cold, and entirely lethal. "You're going to load it fast, and you're going to speak to Mrs. Miller with the respect a lady is owed, or I'm going to drag you over this counter and teach you some manners. Do we understand each other?" Dawson's greasy smile vanished. The color drained from his face, leaving him the shade of old oatmeal. He looked at Harlan's cold, dead eyes, then at the gun on his hip. He swallowed audibly. "Yes, sir. Right away." Dawson scrambled to the back room, hauling the heavy flour sacks with frantic desperation. Cora didn't wait for him to finish. She turned on her heel, her heavy skirts kicking up dust, and marched out of the store. Harlan followed her to the wagon. "I didn't ask for your help," she hissed, turning on him the moment they were clear of the door. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a blinding, unfamiliar rage. He was disrespecting you, Harlan said, his brow furrowing. He's been disrespecting me for 3 years. That's how it is. Cora poked a thick finger hard into Harlan's chest. I survive in this town by ignoring them. I don't need a white knight. I am not a delicate flower that needs protecting. I know you aren't, Harlan shot back, his own voice rising. I know you're tough as boiled owl. But you shouldn't have to be. Not all the time. You have no right to fight my battles. I have the right to defend a woman I care about. The words echoed off the weathered planks of the mercantile. Cora froze. The anger instantly evaporated from her veins, replaced by a shocking breathless vacuum. She stared at him. The bustling noise of the street, the clatter of hooves, the shouts of men, the creak of wagon wheels seemed to mute itself entirely. Harlan looked just as surprised as she did. He ran a hand through his dusty hair, letting out a heavy, frustrated breath. He looked away, staring down the sun-bleached street. Harlan, Cora whispered. He looked back at her. The lethal coldness was gone from his eyes, leaving only a raw, unvarnished vulnerability. I've been on the trail a long time, Cora, he said quietly. I've seen a lot of ugly things, met a lot of ugly people. But I look at you. He stepped closer, entering her space. He didn't crowd her, but he didn't shrink away from her mass either. I look at you, and I see the strongest, most beautiful thing in this entire God-forsaken territory. Cora's breath hitched. She wanted to look away. She wanted to retreat into her armor, to slap him away and call him a liar. But she couldn't. Slowly, Harlan reached out. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed over her skin, tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the rough calluses on his palm. For the first time in her life, Cora didn't feel massive. She didn't feel heavy or burdensome or invisible. Under the warmth of his hand, she just felt cherished. She leaned her face into his palm, closing her eyes, and let out a shaky, trembling breath. The ride back to the boarding house took 40 minutes. The wagon hit every rut in the hardened dirt road, rattling the heavy flour barrels in the back and jarring Cora's teeth. She barely felt the bumps. She was entirely focused on the space between her shoulder and Harlan's arm. They weren't touching. They didn't speak. But the air between them hummed with a thick, static energy that made the afternoon heat feel trivial. When they reached the yard, Harlan unloaded the supplies in silence. Cora went straight to the kitchen. She needed routine. She needed the familiar, punishing burn of the cast-iron stove and the mindless rhythm of peeling potatoes to anchor her mind. But her hands betrayed her. They shook. She dropped the paring knife twice, the metal clattering loudly against the pine floorboards. Supper came and went. The boarders ate, complained about the oppressive humidity, and shuffled off to the saloon or their beds. Harlan ate his stew in his usual corner, washed his own bowl at the yard pump, and disappeared upstairs. By 10 o'clock, the house was dark and silent. Cora sat on the edge of the mattress in her private room off the kitchen. She wore a simple, unadorned white cotton nightgown. Without the heavy corset, the thick wool shawl, and the rigid layers of calico, she felt terrifyingly exposed. Her flesh settled naturally, heavy and soft, spilling over her hips and thighs. She stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above her washstand. She didn't see beauty. She saw a woman built for labor. Her knuckles were permanently swollen, her skin perpetually flushed from the relentless heat of the stove. She was a woman who had survived by turning her heart into stone, sweeping out the ghost of her husband alongside the daily dirt. She had resigned herself to a life of quiet, invisible utility. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Cora froze. Her thick hands gripped the edge of the mattress, her knuckles turning white. "Who is it?" "It's Harlan." Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked down at her nightgown, at the sheer expanse of herself taking up space on the bed. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. "It's late. Go to sleep." "Can't." His rough voice carried easily through the thin pine door. "Need to talk to you." "We can talk in the morning over eggs." "I might not have the nerve in the morning, Cora. Open the door." She closed her eyes. She could tell him no. She was the boss of this house, the master of her own domain. But she remembered the sudden warmth of his hand in town. The terrifying, intoxicating feeling of being defended and cherished. Slowly, fighting every cynical instinct that screamed at her to barricade the door, Cora stood up. She turned the brass lock and pulled the door open. Harlan stood in the dark hallway. He had taken off his boots and his heavy leather duster. He wore only his canvas trousers and Arthur's old, worn shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. He looked at her. He didn't politely avert his gaze. His pale eyes tracked down her soft, heavy shoulders, the wide, substantial curve of her hips, and back up to her face. There was no disgust. There was no polite pity. There was only a quiet, burning reverence. "Can I come in?" he asked. Cora stepped aside. The floorboards creaked as Harlan walked into the small room. He closed the door behind him with a soft click. Suddenly, the room felt entirely too small. "Your week is up tomorrow," Cora said, her voice trembling slightly. She crossed her thick arms over her chest, a final, desperate attempt to shield herself from his scrutiny. "You leaving?" "Depends," Harlan said. He took a step closer, limping slightly, a permanent reminder of the bullet that had brought him to her door. The smell of him, clean sweat, lye soap, and dry tobacco, filled her lungs. "You want me to?" "I run a boarding house. Men come and go." "I'm not asking about the boarders, Cora. I'm asking about you." Cora looked down at the braided rug beneath her bare feet. "I told you on the porch. I'm a widow. My life is set. I don't have room for a drifter." "I'm done drifting." Harlan stepped closer, stopping only when the tips of his cotton socks brushed her bare toes. He reached out and gently pulled her crossed arms apart. He didn't force her, but his touch was steady and insistent. He laid her broad hands flat against his chest. She could feel the hard, rhythmic thumping of his heart beneath the thin fabric. "I've spent 10 years sleeping on dirt, looking over my shoulder, bleeding for things that didn't matter," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a low, raw whisper. "I walked into this house half dead. You didn't coddle me. You didn't bat your eyelashes at me. You patched me up, put a mop in my hand, and treated me like a human being. You made this place feel like something worth defending." He slid his hands around her waist. His calloused palms rested naturally on the broad, soft flesh of her hips. He didn't try to span her waist. He didn't treat her like something fragile that required careful handling. He just held her, anchoring himself to her solidity. "You take up space, Cora," he murmured, leaning his forehead against hers. "And I like it. I like the weight of you. I like that the wind can't blow you over. I need a woman who won't break when the world gets hard." Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked the corners of Cora's eyes. The final stubborn wall inside her crumbled, collapsing into a heap of dust. She uncurled her fingers, tightly gripping the fabric of his shirt. "I'm not easy," she choked out, a final, desperate warning. "Neither am I," Harlan replied. He tilted his head and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a desperate, fiery clash. It was slow, grounded, deliberate. His mouth was rough, tasting of coffee and the dry frontier heat, but his hands were incredibly gentle, pulling her heavy body flush against his lean, scarred frame. The contrast was stark, his wire and bone against her soft, unyielding bulk, but they fit together flawlessly, like two halves of a fractured stone finally finding their joint. Cora let out a long, shuddering breath, wrapping her thick arms around his neck, finally letting herself be held. She didn't shrink. She didn't hide. She leaned her full weight into him, and Harlan held her steady, exactly as he promised he would. Red Creek would talk. Dawson would sneer. The dust would keep blowing, and the heat would return tomorrow. But standing in the quiet dark of her room, anchored in the arms of a man who saw her exactly as she was, Cora finally knew she wouldn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. The frontier is a harsh place, but Cora and Harlan proved that the strongest foundations are built on honesty, respect, and seeing someone for exactly who they are. Their story reminds us that true love doesn't require you to shrink yourself to fit someone else's world. If this grounded, gritty romance moved you, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories. See you next time.